Hey friends, it has been a while since I last checked in on my fantasy subreddit bingo challenge. When I last checked in at the halfway point in September, my bingo board looked like this, and now it looks like this. Going from top to bottom, here's a quick summary of what I've read and added and changed about the board. I read The Winged Histories by Sophia Samatar for the Hidden Gem prompt. This is a book with under 1,000 ratings on Goodreads. The Winged Histories was indeed a hidden gem, and it still has only 922 ratings on Goodreads, so check it out. I read Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, which fulfilled the Down with the System prompt. I read Catabasis by R.F. Kuang, which fulfilled the Impossible Places prompt, given that that is a story about descending into hell. I read Pyramids by Terry Pratchett, which fulfilled the Gods and Pantheons prompt, and that book was funnier than I expected, even though I know Terry Pratchett is funny. I didn't expect to like the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian setting as much as I did. And I read Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chupeco, which fulfilled the LGBTQIA protagonist prompt because there is a bisexual and polyamorous main character. And I substituted the Recycle a Bingo Square prompt. I was previously using the 5th season, but I have since subbed in The Failures by Benjamin Lyer in that square. The Failures fulfills a prompt from the 2024 board, which is a book that is set underground, and I'm subbing out the 5th season because I want to use the Broken Earth trilogy for the Last in a Series prompt instead, and you're not allowed to repeat an author on the board. This challenge ends March 31st, so my goal for this video is to finish the dang board, and the books I'm planning to read are all in from the library. I have physical copies of most of them. So for the 80s prompt, I will be reading Hadriana in All My Dreams by Renée Depeste. This is a classic Haitian novel about a French woman who is turned into a zombie on her wedding day. This meets hard mode as well, which is to read a book by an author of color. For the high fashion prompt, I will be reading The Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. I have been wanting to read Juliette Marillier for a really long time. She writes predominantly historical fantasy, which is one of my favorite subgenres of fantasy, and I have heard that her prose is very beautiful. But at the same time, I'm just trying to keep my expectations a little bit grounded. For the Last in a Series prompt, as I alluded to, I will be reading The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. I just finished the second book, The Obelisk Gate, a week ago, and I thought that book was okay. I thought it suffered a little bit from second book syndrome in that it dragged a bit and it just kind of felt like it was setting the final book up, but it did end in a place where I wanted to jump into the next book right away. So I am hopeful that we will have a strong ending here. And then for the Elves prompt, I only have an ebook of this one. I will be reading The Bone Harp by Victoria Goddard. I am reading The Bone Harp with a fantasy book club at work, and the main character is an elf who reawakens millennia after his death and returns home, and so that seems like it will be a good fit. And then for the generic title prompt, I am reading The Song for the Basilisk by Patricia McKillip. I was struggling to figure out what to choose for this prompt, and a kind viewer of my last fantasy bingo board video suggested this in my comments. I would like to thank that viewer so much for that comment because Patricia McKillip is another author like Juliette Marillier that I have been meaning to get to for a long time, and I wasn't aware that there was a book she wrote that fit the prompt. So this is great. And then finally, for the Pirates prompt, I have Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is the sequel to The Lies of Locke Lamora. I gave The Lies of Locke Lamora 5 stars when I read it, but I think I've cooled a little bit on it in hindsight. I think the lack of women and the treatment of the few women that were in the first book kind of sours it in my memory in comparison to other fantasy books that I've given 5 stars. So it'll be interesting to revisit this world and this author and maybe remember what I enjoyed so much about the first book that I gave it 5 stars. So that is what I'm going to be reading for this video. I will be checking in as I work my way through each book. I will say several of these books are older and therefore don't have audiobook options, which makes me nervous about how quickly I'll be able to get through them. I usually have one audiobook and one physical read going at a time, but I do take longer to read books with my eyes only. But I've given myself ample time, I think, to finish before March 31st. We'll see. So that's the video, that's the challenge, and I will check back in when I've read some book. See you then. Hey friends, I'm a little more than halfway through The Bone Harp by Victoria Goddard. I am reading this with a book club at work. I recently joined a fantasy book club, and our first book of the year is The Bone Harp. I have never participated in an in-person book club before, and I wasn't totally sure what to expect, but it has been really fun, and I think it has helped me appreciate this book more than I would have otherwise. So this book is about an elf war bard named Tamsin as he returns to his elvish homeland called Elfland after countless years of war and questing abroad. So essentially, he was in Middle Earth for millennia before returning back to Valinor. And it is Middle Earth and Valinor. I never was able to finish the Silmarillion, but my understanding is that this book, The Bone Harp, is essentially Silmarillion fan fiction or like direct homage. It lifts several events and people and storylines, renames them a little bit, and then tells a story about the aftermath of what most books would treat as the main event. The Silmarillion, I don't think, treats it as the main event, but like other contemporary fantasy stories would treat this war and quest as the main event, and this is the aftermath as he is recovering. And I recognized immediately that the bones of the story were Tolkien shaped, but other members of this book club I'm in were able to tell me exactly how Tolkien shaped it is. And so for me, it being very Tolkien inspired is neither a draw nor something that turns me off, but I think it could be for other people, so it just seems important to know to get the full picture of what this book is doing. I would say that so far my feelings are a little mixed on this book, as I have already alluded to. As a whole, this book seems very light on plot and heavier on relationships and personal growth, which is not always my preference. I like a book with some more propulsion to it. But I enjoyed part one because as our main character, Tamsin, wakes up in his homeland, he is relearning gentleness and his skill at singing that he lost for a very long time when he was at war. He has held several titles over the years, not all of them very complimentary. He has honed and lost different skills, and there are these feelings of reinvention and recovery that I thought were really beautifully explored, and it's a topic, it's a theme that I'm interested in. And then we get into part two, and that started to feel redundant, and it dragged a lot, in my opinion. Part two explores what happened at home in Elfland while Tamsin and a lot of other elves were abroad from the perspective of Tamsin's rival and lover, Clara. I think that Clara is not very interesting as a character. She is almost exclusively described in comparison or in contrast to Tamsin. Clara and Tamsin have this sun and moon, yin and yang energy to their characters, and that does set up some beautiful symbolic passages. But Tamsin in part one had some interesting flaws, while Clara in part two, we don't actually see enough of her individuality to say whether or not she has flaws. So I'm curious to see where this takes us in part three. I think the symbolism is very classic and beautiful, and the story has this gentleness that I'm drawn to. It's not quite cozy fantasy, but it's not cozy fantasy. But I'm looking for the pace to pick up again in part three, and I hope that it pulls back from the epic Tolkien mode of writing that was happening in part two and leads more into the character depth like it did in part one. And I want it to make me cry. I think that's actually really what I'm looking for. I hope that it gets me to a place where I cry at the end. Hello, I am now about 3/4 of the way through The Stone Sky, and I am almost certainly going to like this book more than the second one. And my impression is that we are wrapping things up in a way that is both exciting and compelling, and that is not easy to do, especially for a book series in a world that is as big in scope as this one is. I'm trying not to spoil anything about this series because this is the last book in the trilogy, but the framing of this series is that the world is in danger on a planetary level. Civilizations rise and fall, and this is about the fall of a civilization, but the planet goes on. Except in this case, the stability of the planet is also at risk. And what N.K. Jemisin does in this book and the series as a whole is really manipulate and play with the scale of the action in time and place, even with these very macro level stakes in the background. We are engaged with the family unit and what we pass down to our children, but also the culture that is formed at the level of the community and society and nation state and species. It is very intricate and very well done, in my opinion, and very thought-provoking. And this final book is giving us a lot more background about the history of this world and the civilizations that came before, the one we're in now in the story. And that is sometimes a little info dumpy. It walks a line between hard science and magic that might be tough for fans of one or the other to swallow. I do sometimes wish that the magic system was a little more rigidly defined, but I do find it satisfying how the pieces are all coming together here in the final stretch. So I'm looking forward to seeing how she sticks the landing. Hello, I am halfway through Hadriana in All My Dreams, and this book is bizarre in a positive, reading outside of my comfort zone kind of way. Where to start? This book is provocative and kind of bawdy, B-A-W-D-Y, bawdy. We're getting a zombie story that is highlighting the cultural and religious divisions between white Europeans and Creole and Native Islanders, between European Christianity and Haitian voodoo. I think that's the overarching context. The writing on the page tackles this in the weirdest, quirkiest way possible. In the opening chapter, we see a dead woman being driven to the beach at the Bay of Jacmel, wearing what seems like a carnival mask, but what is actually a butterfly. And the butterfly was formerly a man who was cursed to be a butterfly as punishment because he was too sex crazed. And even in his butterfly form, he is somehow seducing young maidens and ruining marriages. And we're just getting warmed up because we haven't gotten to Hadriana. Hadriana is a white French girl who is getting married to a local boy when she mysteriously dies in the middle of the marriage ceremony. There is a debate about what to do for her wake because there are carnival festivities planned, which they decide not to cancel. And instead, there is this hilarious and colorful depiction of this Catholic funeral meets pagan celebration. And then the morning after the burial, Hadriana, her body is found to no longer be in her grave. And so she is presumed to be a zombie. And that is where I'm at in this book. If the purpose of this hard mode prompt was to get me out of my comfort zone and read more diversely, then the mission is certainly accomplished, and I think I am enjoying myself also. I am curious to see where else this goes, because it has been a whirlwind already. Hello again. I have an update to share about both Red Seas Under Red Skies and Song for the Basilisk. First, I want to say it is fascinating to be reading from a mass market paperback again. I feel like this size paperback has basically gone extinct, and I guess that speaks to the age of these books. Red Seas was published in 2007, and Song for the Basilisk was published in 1998. But I'm about halfway through these books. I think I'll start with talking about Red Seas. This is the second book in a series, so I will try not to spoil anything about the first book, but I am going to talk about the plot very generally, so if you think you will be particularly sensitive to spoilers on this one, feel free to skip ahead. That disclaimer out of the way, I am having a ton of fun reading this. I think I mentioned in the intro that I gave the first book 5 stars, but in hindsight, it had kind of diminished. But this book is strong in ways that make me think yes, this one will also be 5 stars, and I can see why I would give it 5 stars, even despite seeing some flaws with it. These books are about a con artist named Locke Lamora and his con artist friends, and it's the kind of book that doesn't necessarily have particularly deep or realistic character work, but it is clever and well plotted and really propulsive. At the beginning of this book, Locke Lamora is nursing his wounds from the end of the first book. He has fled the city of Camor, where the first book takes place and where he grew up, and he has started a new multi-year long con to rob a heavily guarded gambling house called the Sin Spire with his friend Jean in the island city of Talvarat. So we have a new setting, we have this buddy male friendship thing going on, we have a heist, we have planning and plotting. Something I really like about this book, and this is the same as the first book as well, it alternates between a current timeline and a flashback timeline, and that's really effective in my opinion because it shows you the planning and the setup side by side with the execution of the con and the wins and the failures. There's a lot of dramatic irony with the flashbacks, and there's also like an element of training montage, so the wins feel earned because you also get to see how they prepared for them. And I would say the heist is like the initial setup, but it's not the only or even the primary angle here, because if you recall, I'm reading this book for the Pirates prompt, and it's got a ship on the cover, and what's happening is that Locke and Jean are under threat from multiple sources beyond just like getting caught by the owner of this gambling house. One of those outside threats is savvy to the fact that they are con artists and is basically forcing them to pretend to be pirates for his own personal reasons. And that plotline is just kicking off now, and I think it will be very fun. These books remind me a lot of another series that's a 5 star for me, The Lyman Chronicles by Dorothy Dunnett. Also her House of Niccolo series. Dorothy Dunnett is a historical fiction writer, but her series and this series, and I think the con artist heist genre as a whole, appeal to me as fantasies of competence. I like stories about incredibly competent heroes executing precise plots in high stakes conditions. It's a lot of fun when it's executed well. And there's also like a Robin Hood dynamic that you see a lot in heist movies. There are several gruesome depictions of the poor and working class being mistreated and played with at the expense of the wealthy and powerful. And our main characters were raised with beliefs around the god of thieves, in which the followers of this god of thieves have a mandate to remind the rich that they are not invincible. And that is kind of the other side of the coin that people tend to love with heist movies, is the idea that the person being stolen from kind of deserves it, even if the thieves themselves don't always have the most altruistic of motivations. It feels good to see the man like get what's coming to him. So in summary, I'm having a grand time with this. I think it's really good for a second book in the way it's building up the world and the web of crime and power within it. I might even be enjoying it more than the first book, and I'm really excited to get into the pirate stuff. Moving on to Song for the Basilisk, I am enjoying this one as well, but it is a very different vibe. This book also has some like danger to it, but it's less thrilling and more of a quiet, tense, personal simmer. It is actually quite an interesting book to compare to the Bone Harp, because this book has a bard main character who survived something harrowing and is working through that trauma in the book. So, actually, quite similar with certain plot elements. This book opens with a massacre of a noble family by another noble house. Our main character is Rook, and he survived this massacre as a child and was secretively sent to live on a remote island to be raised among bards and musicians under a false name. So Rook is not actually his real name, but he has suppressed most of his memories from before he came to the island. So when the story starts, he doesn't remember his old name. Towards the end of the first part of the book, he does begin to remember and seek answers, and the house that massacred Rick's family still seems to be in power on the mainland, but it seems like there is this brewing grassroots opposition among the remnants of Rook's house and maybe other allied houses. But what I love so far, and what makes this book so distinctive to me, is that he doesn't really go on this growth journey. Rook doesn't go on his growth journey until he's already a middle-aged man with a grown child. He has really built a life around avoidance of certain hard questions. He avoids certain instruments and ways of playing because they make him remember his past, and that makes him uncomfortable. His wife and the mother of his child is prodding him to leave the island with her because she wants to be a proper bard and play for people, and eventually she leaves him to go live on the mainland. And that's not a huge element of the book. It's not like this is some kind of divorce drama or anything. They're separated, but they still seem to love each other, and his son comes back to live on the island with him. But it shows that he has really become entrenched in a life before he goes off again to remember his past. And I think that any other fantasy book would make him have this journey and this self-realization journey as a teenager. But I love that this is not a coming of age tale, but it's a tale where someone confronts their wounds in midlife. And to me, that makes it similar to the Bone Harp, and I think I'd like this one more than the Bone Harp so far. The prose is also really lyrical and beautiful. It's a very atmospheric book, more atmospheric than plotty, although there is a plot. There's this sort of dynastic power struggle going on that I'm enjoying a lot. So these two books are very different, but I'm very excited to continue reading both. Hey friends, I'm about a third of the way through Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier, and I'm happy to say that I am really loving it. This book was originally published in 1999, and the US hardcover edition I have here was published in 2000. And as you can tell, my library copy is a little beat up, but I am having a joyful time reading these older books for this challenge. Another thing I'll note is that this copy is exactly 400 pages long, but these pages are dense pages and they are full top to bottom of text. I saw on Storygraph that there are other editions of this book that are over 600 pages in length, and I can see how that could be the case easily. But let me describe the story a little bit. Daughter of the Forest is a retelling of the fairy tale of the Six Swans, in which a princess's 6 brothers are turned into swans by their stepmother, and to break the spell, the princess needs to sew 6 shirts while remaining mute during the whole process. In this telling of the 6 swans, the setting is Ireland in the Middle Ages. Our main character is a girl named Sorka with 6 brothers, and her father is a Celtic chieftain, and in this time period he is preoccupied with defending Ireland, defending his territory from invasions by the native British as well as the Vikings. Something else notable about the time period is that Sorka's family obeys a form of native paganism, but Christianity is present and is making inroads. Sorka herself is something of an herbalist and a healer from a young age, and she and her family has an interesting relationship with Father Brian, who is a Christian hermit who lives nearby and has taught Sorka and her brothers to read and write to an extent. I would say this book is a slow burn. Where I'm at, roughly 1/3 of the way through the book, the brothers have just been turned into swans by their wicked stepmother Una, and Sorka has just learned about the requirements needed from her to break the spell. But I've enjoyed the setup so far. We've established the personalities of all 6 brothers, which is really impressive, and we've established the setting that I just described through primarily through a plot that Sorka and a couple of her brothers were involved in to free a British captive from their own family dungeon. Sorka at this point in the story is only 12 or 13 years old, but she helps nurse this British boy named Simon back to health, and he's a few years older than her and has been tortured pretty badly at the hands of her father's men. At that point, when her wicked stepmother Una comes into the picture, she has to abandon the boy Simon, but it seems to me that he will be back as a romantic love interest in due time. There was a lot of hints that way. So I don't really know what more to say about this book at this time, except that I'm really loving the writing, and I feel like I really do care about what happens to Sorka and her brothers, and I think that investment in the characters does depend on the detail that was put into this first section before the brothers are turned. So I'm really enjoying the mixture of fantasy and history here, and I'm hoping I can finish this book in the next week so I can finish this video once and for all. I have finally finished reading all 6 books for this video, and I am back to give you my final ranking and review for each book. One thing I wanted to mention that only stood out to me after I started reading is that the average original publication date for all of these books is 2005. Hadriana was originally published in 1988. Song for the Basilisk and Daughter of the Forest are late 90s books. Red Seas Under Red Skies is 2007. The Stone Sky is 2017. And then The Bone Harp was the most recently published book. It was published in 2024. I thought that was interesting because I think I tend to prioritize new releases a lot. So it was nice to get outside of my comfort zone on this challenge, especially for these final prompts where I had to push myself a little harder to complete them because I didn't accomplish them in the course of my normal reading in the last year. I think that's one of the joys of this challenge, is that it pushes me outside of my comfort zone, and I had a lot of fun reading these more backlist books. So with that said, let me get into it. In 6th place, I have The Bone Harp by Victoria Goddard. I liked that this book used an elf who has lived a very long time to explore how we heal from trauma and how we reinvent ourselves throughout our lifetime. But I kind of felt disappointed in the way it was executed. In my first check-in, I talked about how the middle part of the book dragged for me and how some of the side characters felt one-dimensional. What disappointed me most, I think, is that our main character, Tamsin, for all that he is traumatized from war and from he was cursed to wander away from his homeland for centuries, in his healing process, he never backslides or encounters real consequences for the mistakes he made. So it feels like a feel-good story for healing, but it didn't feel satisfying because it didn't feel real or challenging. So I don't know. I still think that people who enjoy cozy fantasy and people who enjoy Tolkien-esque stories might like this, but it wasn't for me. In 5th place, I have Hadriana in All My Dreams. This book was challenging to read because it was so outside of my normal context of reading, but this also exemplifies why it is rewarding to read diversely. The way this book uses zombie folklore to talk about Haitian culture and Haitian colonial history is so cool, but it also demands you work a little bit if you're not familiar with that context. I also think the writing itself is very surreal and really written far outside of the structure that modern mainstream fantasy books tend to be written in. If I'm recommending this to people, I would recommend this book to people who like classics or translated literature more than I would recommend it to people who like fantasy, or at least I would recommend it through that lens, because I I thought this was really intellectually stimulating, more so than it was enjoyable, but I recognize that that is in large part because it is so outside of my own comfort zone. In fourth place, I have Song for the Basilisk by Patricia A. McKillip. This was my first book by Patricia McKillip, and I am definitely interested in reading more from her catalog after this. The writing was very lyrical, and it has a fairy tale quality in that the characters and the plot are quite archetypal. So in this case, for this book, we have the one child that escaped the destruction of his house and then returns later to avenge his family. That is a very classical kind of revenge arc, but I appreciated the way that McKillip defies expectations in some ways. So one of those ways is that the main character is fully in his late 30s when he begins his revenge arc. And also the writing itself is gorgeous, and I think the prose itself, I would say, is the primary draw for this book because it's so heavy with imagery and metaphor, and it makes the description of the music, because our main character is a bard, it makes it so vivid, and it also makes the conflict between the houses really rich and interesting to read because each house is represented by an animal or a way of being, and it's just really flavorful as you're reading it. I do think the prose sometimes leans towards overly flowery in that it became confusing to read. I had to reread to try and figure out what was going on. And I think that could be a hard turnoff for some readers. But more often than not, I think it enriched what is a very classic narrative of revenge and healing and forgiveness. In third place, I have The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. Again, this is the final book of a series, so I'll be somewhat vague with my review here, but I think this book provided a really satisfying, thought-provoking, bittersweet ending for a series that is concerned about justice and cycles of oppression. I think this series as a whole asks us to confront how people react to oppression and persecution, and it doesn't let us be comfortable in the moral math of what it means to rebel and retaliate against oppression. Now that I am thinking about these side by side, the themes in this book are actually not dissimilar to the themes of revenge in Song for the Basilisk, but like I said in my earlier check-in, I think what N.K. Jemisin is really great at is flexing between personal stakes and societal stakes and drawing the connections between those things. Yeah, I really liked this series a lot as a whole. In second place, I have Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Merlier. This is what I will be holding up going forward as the standard by which I'm judging other romantasy books against, because I'm not a lover of the romance genre, and I also have some quibbles with the romantic elements of this book as well, but none of that stopped me from giving this book 5 stars. What really surprised me about this book and what I loved about it is that it is really bittersweet. It is structurally a romance because the hero and the heroine are together at the end, but there is real collateral damage that occurs because of this plot to turn the brothers into swans and this test of endurance required by Sorka to get them back. And it's not just that, but this sibling bond that carries through the entire novel and drives the plot and is beautifully depicted. That sibling bond can't remain as it is in its pure childhood form forever. This is a coming of age story as much as it is a romance, and part of growing up is for the different family members to go on their own separate journeys and adventures. And the bittersweet aspect of that, of the siblings kind of drifting apart, really took me by surprise and really elevated this book for me. In terms of the romance element, check your triggers before reading. There is an on-page rape in the first half of the book that shapes Sorka's journey in profound ways, and there is also an age gap that the text does not interrogate very deeply at all. So those elements will understandably be deal breakers for some readers, and Yeah. That said, the core relationship is restrained and respectful and built on earned trust, and I thought it was very beautiful. It's a slow burn, star-crossed lovers kind of relationship. If I have one criticism, it's that the male love interest is almost too perfect. He's endlessly patient and perceptive and honorable, and because of all that, all the friction in the relationship comes from external forces rather than internal incompatibility or growth that needs to happen. But that's not even really a problem. It's just where I feel myself pushing back against romance as a genre, maybe. This book also does end with some threads left dangling for the sequel, which I am interested in reading. I'm really glad that I finally read Juliet Merlier, and I think I will like her work in general. And finally, in first place is Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is an adventure fantasy that fits very squarely in my personal taste and enjoyment bucket. It's melodramatic, it's clever, it's executed with fun and flair. The pirates were incredibly entertaining. The reversals were dramatic. The tension was thrilling. If I have one criticism of this book, it's that the character motivations and relationships are not always laid out in the most convincing or compelling way. They are always laid out clearly, but I don't necessarily believe in them deeply since all of these characters and their motivations are really heightened in the first place. But it's hard to think of that as a flaw because the heightenedness of it all is the joy of it. So I will definitely read the third book at some point, though I'm in no rush to catch up at the moment since fans have been waiting for the fourth book for over a decade. So if the fourth book comes out, I might speed up speed up what I'm reading. But I really like this world, and I like that we got to see more of it in this book. And with that, I have finished the Art Fantasy Book Bingo Challenge from 2025. I will post my bingo board somewhere so that you can see what I read, and feel free to ask me about it in the comments. I had fun doing it. Like I said earlier, I enjoy the little pushes it gives me to read outside of my usual habits, and I'm looking forward to doing the 2026 challenge when it gets released next month. If you completed or are still wrapping up this challenge, I would love to hear how you're doing with it and what your favorites have been in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, bye.